So welcome. We are officially starting our webinar, and Lily, I'm grateful on behalf of our board that you are able to join, and I'm grateful for the speakers that they created time. This is their personal time and they've been able to join us. So, and for the participant, I'm grateful that, instead of enjoying the weather or else doing anything else, you have decided to join in this important discussion. So thank you. But before we begin, we are going to honor the land, and then we are going to proceed.
I would like to start by honoring the land that we are on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nations. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements, and is home to many indigenous nations from across Tortu Island, including the Inuit and Métis. These treaties and other agreements, including the One Dish and One Spoon Rampion Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We mindful of vocal covenant, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomer in this generation or generations past. I would like to also acknowledge those of us who came here forcibly, particularly as a result of transatlantic slave trade. Therefore, I honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. Thank you.
Thank you, Benita. Once again, this is going to be recorded for education purposes. So if you need help in another language like French, Spanish, Yoruba, and Kinyarwanda, please text me and we're going to try and interpret for you. So welcome and thank you for joining us. And why are we here to begin with? So this month, we are going to highlight the mental health, particularly for racialized people. So yesterday when I was talking to Professor, I was like, why do we care about racism? Why now? And why should we consider it a health crisis? What he said was, imagine every time you go to a grocery, somebody follows you. Every time a police officer sees you, they stop you sometimes for no reason. When you go to a hospital, you wait for hours before they recognize you. These small indignities and major ones that we see, especially Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, they experience on everyday basis. Over time, the body wears out and they create a mental health problem. But we also have another pandemic. It's not only the racism that we face, but it's also that sometimes when we have these issues like health issues, even in hospitals, we are likely not to be treated. We have seen and we have heard stories of people who die in hospitals because they've been neglected. And what about the images we see every time on our TV? When policemen are kneeling on Black men, what does it do to our health? So today we're going to ask these questions, but also we're going to ask what happens when the boss doesn't want to promote you? What happens when every time if you have a degree, you apply for a job, you don't get a job. You live in poverty. What happens when you constantly worry where the next meal is going to come from? Because we have been, again, not only systematic racism, structural racism, but even on individual level, what happens? These are the questions that our speakers are going to explore. And some of the speakers, and to those who are here early, they work with prison system. So what happens in there? These are the questions that our speakers are going to answer. And also we are going to, as collective, come up, what do we do? Why do we move from here? Because as we've said through these webinars, from slave trade, colonialism, and now racism, the systems of oppression keep renaming themselves, but the impact on Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, and other people of color is still the same. It's social death. And that's why we're going to challenge racism in healthcare system today, but also come up with a solution on individual level and also collectively what we can do. And of course, we're going to call on allies somebody again, same professor told me, we cannot do it alone. Again, throughout the history, for slave trade to come to an end, for apartheid to come to an end, for colonialism to come to an end, there were good white people who joined forces with Black people to end this power of oppression. So even as today in our generation, if we are to end racism, we would need ally. So I want to thank people who are ally, who have joined us today, and thank you. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and our speakers are going to tell us why they even honored our invitation at our board today. Why today? So I'm going to start with Juliana. Juliana, welcome, and please introduce yourself. And why did you honor our invitation today?
Thank you so much, Sandrine. Hello, thank you everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. I work at Elizabeth Fry, Toronto. I spoke about it a little bit earlier today before we sort of officially started the meeting. At Elizabeth Fry, we work with women, non-binary and genderqueer folks that are either involved with or at risk of being involved with the criminal justice system. I myself have been working within the mental health and substance use systems for over 15 years now, specializing in trauma, substance abuse, and mental health. So really happy to be here to talk about how race has such an integral impact, and stigma has such a huge impact on our mental health and substance use. I came today because this is such an important topic. It is such an overlooked thing. And as you know, I want to use my white privilege to be an ally, to be somebody that can sort of speak to all of the horrible injustices that are happening in our society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And before I mispronounce the name one more time, so Professor, this is your time. Thank you. Professor.
The name is Magnus Mfoafo-M'Carthy. I'm originally from Ghana, born and bred. I'm currently a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in the Faculty of Social Work. And my research focuses on mental health and disability. And I look at issues of stigma as it applies to mental health. And I do quite a bit of work in Canada and also in certain countries in Africa, particularly Ghana. And prior to moving into academia, I worked at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health for about 10 years as a community treatment order coordinator. So I'm quite familiar with the community and passionate about it. Why today? In actual fact, I'm really passionate about issues relating to mental health within the BIPOC community. And anytime issues of this nature come up, I'm more than willing to share the little knowledge that I know, and also to engage in the discourse, because I think that it's important for us to engage in conversations about these things. And until we do that, we're always going to be oppressed, marginalized, and discriminated against. But I think this is the time for us to start moving ahead. As an individual, what I struggle with is, why should we wait for George Floyd to die before we start appointing diversity, equity, and inclusive leaders and other things? And that is something that I'm still grappling with. But the opportunity is here, and I think it's really important for us to take advantage of it and push for change in our community and our society as a whole.
Thank you, Professor. And of course, Richard, please welcome and thank you. Why today? The same question, why today? And why should we care about racism, especially in health?
Thank you very much. I'm Richard Miller, the founder of Keep6ix nonprofit organization, which is an organization that focuses on the marginalized community, but also focuses on individuals been through the justice system. I myself have lived life experiences, and after seeing what goes on behind the walls and the doors of the justice system, I wanted to be a voice, but I also wanted to advocate it for changes. One of the reasons why I decided to be here today was I strongly feel that there is still a lot of suppression that goes on today in the justice system. We may still talk about diversity and so forth, but there is still the same method or or theories from 400 years ago is still happening today. And one of my personal mandate is to speak up about it, but also to hold our government and people at the table accountable for their actions.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have heard from our speakers. So a little bit about ABOD. What we do, Giselle, and who we are, and why we decided to hold these forums.
Hello, everyone. My name is Giselle. I am a social worker and coordinator of the Gender-Based Violence Initiative with the ABOD Community Service Center. And we are very happy and grateful that you're here to join us today on this conversation. So a little bit about ABOD Community Service Center. We are a registered nonprofit organization and has been serving our residents since 2017. We do service the North York, Jane and Finch, Black Creek Humber Summit, including the GTA. ABOD is inclusive and does not believe that anyone should be turned away. We serve this by following our vision, which is a future where members' mental health and mental well-being is achieved. And our mission is to ensure that all vulnerable members of the community have access to food, which we do with our food bank on Tuesdays. They are socially connected. We have our FAGI and game nights, especially for our seniors, to help with social isolation. Empowerment and social determinants of health are met, and providing resources, programs, and services through our webinars that we have with anti-hate, anti-racism, and also webinars with the Gender-Based Violence Initiative. Our mandate, it includes empowering members of the Black and vulnerable racialized community, and we provide a wide range of resources, programs, and activity to promote physical, mental health well-being for our members of the community with a focus on cultural sensitivity. And these programs will be discussed a little bit later on, but we would like to welcome you and thank you so much for taking your time to meet with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Giselle. And so again, welcome. So I'm going to pose, like, every speaker has been given a question, and they're going to try to answer that question. And it's going to be in a kind of panel discussion format. And of course, later on, we're going to have questions from participants. So the first question goes to Professor. Again, how does really racism, what are the pathways in which racism create or is undermine health? Why does racism perpetuate health inequalities in our system, in our community?
Thank you for the question. So if I had it correctly, asking how it perpetuates
pathways,
mental health in our society. And I think the earlier question talked about horrifying images that we see and information that we hear in the news and the media and other things, and how that impacts people's mental well-being. So I would engage in this conversation in the form of, I'll engage in discourse in the form of a conversation and just try and bring us all along so that we journey through together. Periodically, we hear names like, I don't know how many of us were around when this happened, but it happened just about 2 years ago. So I'm sure a lot of us heard about it. When we hear the name Ijaz, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, Chowdhury. This was a 62-year-old individual diagnosed with schizophrenia. Family called the police for a wellness check. And this individual found himself dead. Eventually, he was shot by the police. And when the police was quizzed about it, the information that came up is, well, when they went to the home, this individual was holding a knife. So as a result, self-defense, and we'll look at it and ask ourselves, well, knife, gun, what is the deal? This happened not to be the first incident. That happened in June 2020. And also we heard the story about this individual by name Regis Korchansky. I'm sure I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Parkway. Another call for wellness check. All that we heard was she's falling off the 24th floor of her apartment building. As to what happened, we don't know up till now. And the question that comes up is both parties, both individuals happen to be from racialized background. this is not the only incident that we've heard of in our society. Right now, the family of Chantel Moore, I don't know how many of us are familiar with the name, they called, I think they said a police officer had to go to this individual's home and for a wellness check. Also, she ended dead, and this woman happened to be an Aboriginal individual. Another one that really is close to home, even though it didn't happen in this country, was recently an individual by the name Jalen Walker, who was shot about 60 times in Ohio. Now, when you hear all these things, how do you feel as a racialized person? You know, anytime, you become extremely aware of your surroundings. Anytime you step out of your home, you wonder whether perhaps somebody is going to call the police on you or anything of that nature is going to happen. And as we continue as racialized folk, BIPOC folk, as we continue entertain these thoughts, and we see these things around us, the question that we ask ourselves is, where do we stand in a society like this? A lot of us, when our children are leaving homes or even our family members, even these days, either male, female, whoever they are, we have to give them the talk and say, be careful. When the police officer stops you, make sure you stop, put your hand on the steering wheel, and make sure when they ask you any question, make sure you respond. How long would we have to live in an environment where we find ourselves not pretty safe because anything at all could happen? These things really get at us, and it affects our mindset, because when you are conscious of who you are and where you go and your surrounding and other things, it gets to a point where it affects your psyche. And the moment it affects your psyche, when it continues, so we will talk about affecting your mental health. And if it continues for a long period of time, a lot of us, we do not have the ability or the strength to be able to pretty cope in the midst of these things. So it results in mental illness. So here we've moved from it impacting our mental well-being, our mental health, to becoming a chronic issue where there are times we have to be hospitalized as a result of these things. We see these things virtually everywhere. So I'll start by talking about the healthcare system. Literature tells us about people who go to hospitals, who perhaps maybe exhibit either symptoms of depression and other things. And more often than not, they are diagnosed as having schizophrenia. We don't have to discriminate between the two, but what we need to bear in mind is that one form of mental illness seems to be higher than the other one. You know, one tends to be more serious. Schizophrenia tends to be more serious. So when you are medicated for an illness that is not there, what is the message that is being sent across? You go to a hospital and even you are not well treated because of who you are, because of where you're coming from. There are times if your family do not have the wherewithal to seek a second and third opinion, you are not even diagnosed properly. And that affects your health as an individual. So these things go on and on and on. And even in terms of practice, we have people from racialized background who are in the health field, some in medicine, and they talk about even challenges that they have. They go for rounds, go rounds in the hospital, and at times some of the patients treat them as if they are cleaners and other things. Why? Because in their mind, they know that racialized folk are not supposed to be doctors. And also the lack of Black professionals, in the healthcare system. Recently, a friend sent me a report from the US that talked about a lot of Black folk being disqualified from specializing, and the challenges that they have. And as a result, a lot of them committing suicide. So I thought of really fact-checking this information, and I happen to have a distant relative who's an OBGYN in Indiana, and I checked in with her, and she was telling me about the fact that when she was a medical student, when she was doing her residency, she almost committed suicide. This happened to be an information that a lot of us did not know until I confronted her with this information. So imagine what Black folk or BIPOC folk go through in our healthcare system. Now let's move to the educational system. There have been studies that have been done in Toronto in particular about high school system where Black folk, Black children do not graduate high school. And the number is really staggering. And it's all because of, the racist mindset, because the curriculum is really focused on, the dominant system. And hence, it leaves a lot of kids behind. So the lack of education really affects a lot of these people. I teach in a tertiary institution, and in the graduate program, we don't have a lot of people from particularly racialized background, particularly Black and other cultures. So these are challenges that we are confronted with on a regular basis. And the question that you may want to ask is, why wouldn't these things, and even the teachers that teach, tons of them do not have any knowledge about racial issues? You know, even the way they talk, topics that they bring in conversations, the way they engage students and other things, it makes you question, why wouldn't this affect individuals' background? Be it depression, anxiety, and the list goes on and on and on. Now let's go into policing. I did mention the issue about police a little bit, but let's talk about it one more time. Recently, we had a chief of police in Toronto coming in to apologize for racially profiling, particularly Blacks in Toronto. It's much as somebody would say what's really humbling, it was really painful as well, because we previously had a Black police chief who during his tenure never acknowledged anything of that nature. You know, so it speaks to the challenges that our community is facing. And with that, imagine its impact on racialized folk who either been incarcerated or, you know, been impacted psychologically by a lot of these things. So the list goes on. And we move on to the workplace, the challenges. You know, until I moved to Canada, I did not know we had something they call the Canadian experience. You know, you could have the highest degree from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, you name it, and they will always tell you you don't have the Canadian experience. But the question that comes up is, if you do not give somebody the opportunity, how do they get a Canadian experience? These are challenges that we are struggling with and we are stuck with. And I think it's about time we start to look at the system as a whole, because the system in itself structurally is racist. And why? Because it's been created to really cater for the dominant group. And I think it's about time we really look at how best we can engage with other people, because Canada has opened the doors, and we've assured people from virtually every country that this is really a place where you can work and take care of your family. And until we deal with the vestiges of oppression and marginalization and discrimination in our system, we're not going to go anywhere. So these are some of the struggles that we have, and a lot of people are struggling with it. And like I said earlier, lately, I mean, since 2020 or 2019, if I'm not mistaken, 2020, somebody can say, well, we are seeing changes. Are there really changes? You know, because the harm is really being caused so much. And I think it's really about time that we start, we pause and ask ourselves the serious questions. Because what is happening is I realize that a lot of organizations and programs and other things are really jumping on the bandwagon with regard to EDI, you know, my organization would say equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And we all get excited about it. But the question that comes up is, after 2 years, are we seeing changes? Is it continue? Is the momentum really going on? Are we still gathering momentum, or is waning? These are some of the questions that we may want to ask ourselves, because these are serious questions we need to ask, because when you look at the history of Canada, it's really based on racism, the way Indigenous people were treated, the way we continue to treat them right now. Some getting killed, lost in prison. You know, we know the number of Indigenous people in the prison system. So all these things, when you think about it, it affects you psychologically and it makes you wonder what the future holds. But I think we need to band together as a group or as a community and start asking the serious questions, because I believe that there's always strength in numbers. And with knowledge, I believe there's so much we can accomplish.
Thank you, Professor. So we've heard we don't have many doctors who are Black or Indigenous or other people of color. We don't have an education system and healthcare system. So where do we have people of color? So again, our next speaker, Juliana, is going to tell us where there are a lot of people of color, where we can find them. If we cannot find them as doctors or as teachers, they should be somewhere, because we are still part of Canadian society. We are here. So where are we? And when we end up in those closed doors where we belong, how are we treated? So please welcome Juliana. Can you please answer that? How is
Yeah, I mean, we all know the incredible, staggering, disproportionate nature of BIPOC folks being incarcerated. Not just incarcerated, but stopped by police. And when they are stopped by police, they are fully charged. Whereas white people having the same interactions with police, it does not happen. There's actually studies that say Black youth not involved with any criminal behavior are more likely to be stopped by police than white youth that are engaged in criminal behavior. So when there's already that disproportionate thing going on, there's this real lack of trust. There's this real cynicism within these communities. Of course, police are not there to protect you, right? That is felt, that is known. So, you know, because of this, there's this lack of trust then creates a lack of safety. And that feeling of lack of safety then causes huge mental health concerns, right? And studies show that stress hormones spike up to 50% in Black male youth who experience vicarious exposure to police-related deaths. Now, this spike in stress hormones impacts our bodies in a million ways. It can affect our immune system, can affect our cardiac system. It affects our body, but it also affects our reaction. This is a trauma that youth have experienced, seeing people like George Floyd die on our TVs. So this trauma that's now been vicariously sort of embedded in this youth not feeling safe to leave their door, it now causes a reaction when there's a high stress situation, something like being stopped by the police. There is then a fight or flight reaction, which is a trauma response. So then understandable fight or flight response happens. Police see that because they already assume guilt. They now see that as a proof of guilt. They now see that as resisting arrest. It then increases this sort of cycle. Instead of understanding the trauma that these youth feel, understanding the trauma that these youth live day to day, they see it as proof of guilt. And then incarceration happens and there is no supports. The act of being involved with the police, the act of being through the court system, the act of being incarcerated, those are all traumas too. So now we're adding on trauma to these people. And then we put them in incarceration and there's no mental health supports. There's no physical health supports. There's no community supports. We're just sort of leaving them to be, you know, and then having a criminal record impacts all these social determinants of health, getting a job, right? Like getting housing. So now all this stuff, plus the stigma and how that stigma affects our mental health. We're way more likely to then have substance use issues, alcohol issues. This trauma that's just piling and piling and piling creates a real hopelessness too within communities. If there's no chance for me to get into higher education, for me not to be hassled by police, for these, you know, to happen, then of course, like there's that sort of helplessness and hopelessness that happens. Also, I'm actually really glad Professor Magnus, I believe was his name, sort of spoke to this, was the idea that there are no doctors of color. There's a real issue with credentialism in our society. And I think we really need to understand the connection, the intersectionality of credentialism and racism. When we expect master's degrees, doctorates to do things like be social workers, be counselors, it creates a system in which there are more and more agencies that are almost completely white staffed. And I'm going to include myself in that, right? I work at eFry and I'm another white face. So when folks come to our agency and they are looking for support, understanding, safety, and all they see is the face of the oppressor, how is that going to make them feel like they have a safe space to land, a safe space to say what's going on for them, to reach out for support, to reach out for help? And so we really need to look at how is credentialism affecting our day-to-day, and how is racism tied up in that, and how can we fix that? I have more to speak to. I know you had some questions about like concrete ways to kind of fix. And when you asked it a question, should I just speak to that or should I wait to the end to talk about that?
Yeah, wait for a second, then yeah, thank you. Thank
No
you,
problem.
Juliana.
No
Thank you.
problem.
Then thank you so much. Again, we've heard what happened, how we end up having this disproportionate number in prison. Then our next speaker is again Richard, and also to continue to speak on the same theme. On the same theme. So my question to him was the United Nations, which Canada is part of, I hope, not only in theory, but also in practice, sign up to this convention. So the understanding is Canada should have the same healthcare system that provides for the general population, with even people who are incarcerated. But that's not the case. And that's what we're going to hear from Richard, what happens behind closed doors, how are people being treated. But really, are they supposed to be treated like they were? Like being in prison shouldn't be a death sentence. And as we have heard from the two speakers before, there are reasons why people end up in prison. Sometimes it's because of circumstances. The system itself is meant in a certain way that when it's governing our bodies, Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, and other people of color, is not empowering you to be a doctor. This system is not empowering you to be a professor, really. It's actually empowering you to end up in prison. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And I'd just like to say first off, it's very interesting listening to the two speakers earlier, because I continue to say one particular statement. And what is going on overall, we are all aware of it. It's oppression, it continues. And please, I want everyone to be aware of one very important thing here today. The system is built, and the system is working exactly the way the system is built to work. I don't want anyone to think that the system is broken or someone is doing something wrong. It is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. So when we are here as a group and we are looking at all what's going on, what we have to look at is how we can sit together and overcome the whole system itself as one, right? Because when you are incarcerated, you can start and just take a look, and we can start from an individual being arrested. If you ever have the opportunity, go to a bail hearing at any provincial courthouse in the city and listen to a Crown attorney and listen to a judge at a bail hearing or a sentencing. One of the key factors is they start to break that individual down and put you in suppression mode. The Crown will say that you're no good to society, although you might have made a mistake or you could have, whatever the crime is. It's all about the negative part of you. Then you leave the courthouse and then you move on to the correctional or the detention center. Well, before you get there, you have to deal with the escort of the guards taking you there. Well, they tell you, they tell you down in the bullpen, you have no rights. If you wanted your rights, you wouldn't have got yourself in here today. Then you get into the correctional facility and they tell you, well, again, you have no rights. Shut up, and this is how it goes. And then when you try to speak up, you get suppressed more. So this is the reason why. And if we all stop and look and go back even to 400 or 500 years ago, it's the same pattern and the same theory that has been happening. We had our men being taken away and being put in jail. We had our women being abused and they were impregnated, and then they couldn't afford to look after kids, and certain things were done to their body and so forth by these people. So when you stop and look at it, this is something that is prominent. So I listened to the professor, and he's got a very good point about, the fact of how racism plays a big part, and we are aware of that. But we cannot change anything until we hold them accountable. And if you stop and look and say, well, hey, let's take correctional service accountable, you will never yet be able to hear a Correctional Service Canada say they will take accountability for something, because it doesn't happen. At this present time, Keep6ix is in a big issue where Black offenders are being beaten. There is guards that build a WhatsApp group called a Misfit group out of the Toronto East, and they speak about what they're going to do to the Black offenders. Correctional says, well, hey, we built a unit called the Safer Unit. Well, just years ago, the same government says, well, we are abolishing segregation. So they've taken all these Black offenders and they've put in this one unit that's called the Safer to see where they would be. Well, guess what? They're locked up for 23 hours a day. They get abused. They don't get to see their family. And then I personally wrote a letter to the Attorney General, Sylvia Jones. And how does Sylvia Jones reply back to me? She says, we do not condone anything like that. We have policies in place to govern that. But there's no time did Ms. Jones ever address the issue of the abuse of her own staff is doing on her watch. And 2 of her staff has been suspended. The Toronto police have gotten involved. So what I am saying here today, we have a large, large issue. And until we are able together and work together as one to combat the fact of what's taking place, we can continue to say, well, we have diversity. Well, sure, you can put that wonderful Black person up front and say, hey, here we are. We have one Black person here. He's a great correctional and he's doing this. But that's not the way it is. The mental health plays a big part. And that's what happens even from the courts. So my point is the fact that when we speak about the mental health act and what happens in the system, they already know what they're doing from the day that person might have made a mistake. It could have been the candy bar. It could have been committed a murder. It could have been an assault on somebody. But the fact of the matter of overall, they are aware of how they are breaking that person down on a mental level. That is the reason why when they say they have the theory of once a person gets out, within 30 days, they're back in. Because they're already programmed. That person comes back out in society, they don't know how to function. They have no tools. So we have to look at that. There's a bigger picture. Even when you're incarcerated, you have limited resources of mental health. You have no support. And then on top of it, even regular health of your well-being. I had a guy who the correctional officers beat him up. His eyes are bloodshot. He came to one of his eyes and said, hey, here's 2 Tylenol, go to your cell. And that's the doctor that's working for them. Right? So these are the things that we as a community do not realize what goes on, that's taking place. Right? But these people don't have a voice because they have fear in them. They're being beaten. They don't have the ability to get out. What they're trying to do is get out to their family. So they're scared. There's fear put into them. It's the same thing the slave master did 400 years ago or 500 years. It's still happening today. It's like if you go to the federal system, I would like everyone to ask you one question. I would like for anyone here to go and open up a corporation and have a business going. And I want you to go and hire an individual and pay them $32 every 2 weeks. And let me know how that comes. Because the federal government has major contracts with the Army. Our parachutes are made. Our beds are made in federal system. Our glasses are made in federal system. Our wardrobes are made in federal for the fire department, for the Army. Our vehicles are repaired. They get paid $32 every 2 weeks. A bottle of shampoo costs $7 for them to buy. You see, a can of tuna costs them $3. So how can you be making millions of dollars off individuals, but when they get out, they have nothing, and you have no support for them? So at the end of the day, we have to look at the overall picture, even as citizens of tax-paying citizens, you know, and what goes on. Everyone has to pay the price for whatever mistake they make or whatever crime they've done. But still, they're still human. Because we all may be from the GTA, but right in the GTA, between Milton, the Etobicoke, and the Toronto East, and Penetanguishene and Lindsay, there's a whole lot of slavery and mental health abuse and physical abuse that's happening here. Is anyone aware even how many people are dying per year? I can tell you that there's about 4 individuals died just last year alone who never had any support and left a halfway house, went to a shelter, and died. You've never heard it on the 6 o'clock news, I'm sure. You know, so we as a community have to deal with the trauma that these individuals have gone through and be able to give them the support, right? That's the first step. If we are going to talk about how can we help, there is trauma, a very, very large amount of trauma that have been induced into these men and women. And until we start investing in addressing the trauma that they've gone through and addressing and giving them education and helping them with the mental health, then we're better in a better society.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Wow. It's true, like every system of oppression has been designed, but I also believe that this system can be redesigned, because I think I wasn't born during the slavery, but I also wasn't born during the colonial time, but I'm here during the racism time. All these systems were designed, but if they could be designed with effort, we can redesign them too. So my next question to the speakers is, we have all these problems on individual, community, and organization level in every sector of our society on Canadian fabric. So what could be done to move forward so that the next generation, they could look back and say, our fathers fought for this. I can walk in the street and meet a police officer and not be scared. I can go to school, not fear that they're going to suspend me. What could be done? I'm going to start with Julia, then Professor, then Richard again.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think number one is accountability. Police, there needs to be accountability with police. They need to stop protecting each other. There needs to be consequences for the racism, for the murders that are happening. They need to sort of stop being actively part of the problem. And I think one way that maybe could happen is if there was a board or a group of BIPOC folks that are not police that can, you know, help review policies and procedures. Because we know the police system is not working and they are hiding what's going on, right? They're hiding what they're doing. Everything's self-defense, everything's swept under the rug. So we need other people to go in there and actually look at what's going on. I also think we need to reallocate the funds, move that money around. We need when there's a police call, we need mental health support, crisis support workers to go on the call. And I also think we need people from that community to be those workers. So it's people from the community serving their community, or at least people that are incredibly culturally competent. There isn't just this go in, you know, guns a-blazing. There needs to be a real understanding of mental health, trauma, all those impacts, and why people might be behaving certain ways, why things might be going on. So we're not going in a place of persecution, but we're going into support. Yeah, we just need to change the culture of police. There is a really, I think there could be a full audit done by queer and BIPOC folks to see what's going on to see the pulse, to see what is this culture? Why is this culture so toxic, so racist, so violent, so oppressive? I think that's what needs to happen, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliana. So my next question is going then to be to Professor Juliana. Just talked about how the police need to be reformed. The police itself need reforming. The policies that have been written to suppress and also to oppress people of color have to be redesigned. That's one way that we can be able to address the systematic injustice system that we see in the criminal sector. But there is also another factor. Personally, when I was at University of Waterloo, I never saw any Black professor. At U of T, I did see a couple of, not really professors, not tenure professors, no, but like assistant professors, which is a huge difference. So, but at University of Waterloo, I never saw any professor. So then my question to Professor is, how do we change the education system? And even the health care system, how do we become doctors? What can be done?
Right.
So Magnus.
Perhaps maybe I'll take us back a little bit, because I think the previous presenters really talked, I mean, there was something they talked about, trauma that piqued my interest. When you are traumatized, it affects virtually every fiber of your being. It doesn't really enable you to move forward, because there's that fear that kind of like draw you back. And it will surprise you to realize that there are brilliant chaps in our community who have not been able to utilize the abilities that they have because of the system in which they find themselves, you know, because they are always held back. Maybe a lot of them found themselves in classrooms where teachers look down upon them and other things. Let me share a story that a student shared with me a couple of years ago in class. She was doing her practicum in a school in Toronto. And she talked about, she was in the kindergarten. I'm not talking about grade 5 or grade 7 or whatever, kindergarten, where a kid had been suspended 5 times. And this kid happened to be a Black kid. Now, the question you need to ask yourself is, what kind of future would this kid have? Because he's been made at that age to realize that he is no good, his trouble, his problem, and hence he cannot be in the classroom. We all react differently. Now, in the Kitchener-Waterloo region, if you're not aware, just want to share a story where, was it this year? I think early this year, somewhere last year, the police was called on a 4-year-old Black kid because the kid was disturbing in class. So the family is now suing the Waterloo Catholic District Board. The question that comes up with all these things, how do we expect our kids to really be able to manifest their God-given talents or abilities that have been placed in them? The system really pulls the chair or the ability out of them even before they reach the age where they can show these things. Now, in certain parts of the world, we have kids who are able to do all kinds of things. So the question that comes up is, why is it that the BIPOC community, particularly the Black and indigenous communities, they are not able to come to that level? And like my brother said earlier, it's systemic and strategic. Imagine having perhaps maybe a minister of foreign affairs or what have you being from maybe a Black community, minister of justice from the Black community and other things. Perhaps that would also serve as a motivation for some of these kids to also ensure that they are capable and maybe the sky is the limit for them. Now, with regard to your question, I believe there is so much that can be done. And I think what is important is community plays a very important role. We need to come together as a community. And one thing that I think, you know, I realized that is holding particularly the BIPOC community back is that divisiveness. You know, there is something we call divide and conquer. Now, in the Kitchener-Waterloo region, for instance, I realized that the Black community have different groups. We have African, you know, people of African descent group. We have the Caribbean group. We have this kind of group and other things. And anytime we have such segments, we are not able to, we don't have that united front. And as a result, we are not able to accomplish much. And I think it's a strategy that has really been successful. And I think it's about time we rally together as a community, you know, and ask ourselves, well, we care for one another. Your concern is my concern. How can we come together I have friends in the South Asian community, and they tell me it's the same thing. People from India and Pakistan, different, from other parts of Asia, different, and all those things. And I think it's about time we rally together as BIPOC folk and say we are fighting a common goal. And until we reach that level, because even within the racialized community, some groups look down upon others, where they treat others not really working hard enough. So the question that comes up is, until we get united, there is nothing we can accomplish. And it's important that we do that. So let me quote something from Henry Louis Gates, the former professor from Harvard University. He said this, he says, education is what gives us a voice to fight oppression. So if we do not educate ourselves, there is no way we would be able to fight the system, because we need to know the system. We need to be a part of that system. So we need to start encouraging our youth to be able to aim high, for such positions as perhaps maybe going to medical school, going to law school and all these things. So they'll be able to fight, the system as it is. And until we get to that level, there isn't much that's going to happen. And also as individuals, we need to learn to equip ourselves and educate ourselves and know our rights. Because if we do not do that, the system is always going to have an impact on us. Where at times we may say, well, because I don't have money to hire a lawyer, I don't have money to do this, I don't have this. How do we educate ourselves to fight the system as it is? So coming to think of it, from my perspective, I think we have a long way to go, but hope is not lost. There's a lot we can do. And this is the time for us to really start moving together and pushing ahead to ensure that we can do these things. And to quote Martin Luther King, he says, when you look at human beings, it's not the color of the skin that really matters, but intent of our character. Because at the end of the day, when we cut each and every one of us, it's the same color of blood that is going to come out. So why do we fight each other? And this is the time for us to really be there for one another and say, hey, how can I be there for you? And that is really important. There is hope, and I'm really hopeful for the future.
Thank you, Professor. But I would push one thing. There is also the quote that says, a master's tool can never destroy their own house. So if in school we are given colonial language, colonial education, how are you going to be given the power to dismantle that house? How is that possible? How do we reconcile those differences?
Would you want me to respond?
Yes, please.
It is true. It is true. It's systemic and it's oppressive. It is. But I think we need to get together, because we live in a society where we have examples. Now, when you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, even though we had people like Martin Luther King and other things killed for what they believed in, we have people taking over, like the Jesse Jacksons and other things. And eventually we have others, until we had someone like Obama being able to occupy the White House. Even though the aftermath, when he left, we were able to see the racial nature of the American system. Hope is not lost. So I think we need to inculcate this can-do attitude in our youth, to make them realize that if it's happened in the United States, where someone like Thurgood Marshall in the 60s or even before, became a Supreme Court judge, we are also capable of raising our children and supporting them to be able to get through the system. It's happened. Last year, was it last year or last 2 years? University of Toronto prided itself, even though I didn't agree with it, they prided themselves by saying they've admitted either 6 or 10 racialized folk, particularly Black kids, into medical school, which was considered history. What my argument to that is, well, if it's done and we have 10 people from the racialized community going to medical school, maybe next time the number is going to increase to 12. It's going to increase to 15, 20. That is how we break into the system. And also the law school, we need to look for BIPOC folk who are going into law school in other professions, social work. We have a number of them in the field. So these are people who are educated. So I think that the floodgates, even though it's not wide opened, it's gradually opening and people are moving in. I belong to a group of academics from Africa who are teaching in universities in Canada, and we have over 103 people. And that tells me that something is happening right now, and they keep winning awards and doing excellent. The dean of, I think, the Faculty of Science or something at Guelph was poached. He was recruited from York University, and is of African descent, in this country. So it tells me that there are role models that we can look up to. So irrespective of the message that is being told to us or being sent to us, that we are incapable, that we are not 100% human, or we cannot think very well like the dominant group or the colonial master, I would think this is a time for us to really disabuse that thought process and say, well, we can do better. And we have folk that we can look up to. And that is what I believe in. I strongly believe in that.
Yes, we can. And I do agree, every system that has been designed can be redesigned, and it's our time to redesign. But there is also something that you said about divide and conquer. I think we had seen it in the Chronicle of Africa, could not have happened without dividing and conquer. There is also another thing sometimes that happens in our communities that teaches us to operate in isolation, because collaboration, if we collaborate, we are competing for resources. So that's another challenge that we face in our communities. But we hear you, this is the time to come together. And if people don't know, last 2020, the Asian population, the unemployment rate was 17. But when the pandemic hit, because of racism again, and Trump was calling it Chinese virus, do you know the unemployment rate had to be 21? So last year, the unemployment rate was 21% for Asians. So we are in this together. Today is Black people, tomorrow is Muslim, tomorrow is Asian. So I think it's really high time we start to collaborate and fight back. So our next speaker again, Richard, welcome. What next? How do we redesign the system to work in favor so that every Black man and woman, every Indigenous human being breathing, and every person of color can enjoy the same quality life as anybody else?
We have to start by coming together. For myself, one of my mandate for 2022 was start collaborating. There's no way that there's no way that,
open my video?
Sorry there. There's no way that we are able to overcome or be able to be at the front by winning if we do not be able to collaborate. You made a very good point in your conversation earlier when you point out about how everybody's fighting when it comes to funding and so forth. And again, that goes back to the way the system is built. What I have learned myself personally is for the last 5 years since I founded my organization by myself, working and investing in my community as a construction worker. And I noticed there's one pattern when it comes to money or funding, if you want to put it. The funding is already allocated to individuals way before you and I hear about it. What is left and what you hear our community says, well, we're applying for this and fighting for, as you put it earlier, that is only the scrap of the barrel. They already know exactly who is getting what. And that I sat down and I started to look into it. So what I did was I went into the community, because I am the person who goes in at what they call the gutter, the trenches that do the work. And I'll ask individual, have you heard tell me of a program that whoever it is that's doing in the community, because I already know that they already received $1 million. Oh, who are they? We don't know of them. But these are the things that goes on. So until we are able to come together, to be at the table and to hold these individuals accountable. When I hear someone like the Attorney General writing me a letter to say, well, we have all this policy in place, but you're the same person who overseeing, and you have two of your officers who is now, you are suspended because of abuse on Black offenders. You don't need to talk to me about your policy. Your policy is just there as a protection. It's not working. The abuse is still happening. You see? So one of the things I learned over the years in the system was I had to learn to speak their language. What we don't realize is all these policies that you might read or see in place, the individual that we're dealing with have no idea what these policies are. They don't understand the language of these policies, and I've proven it myself. If you sat down and take one of those policies and write a grievance back to them, I will guarantee you that that letter that you wrote, or that grievance, is going to Bay Street to one of their lawyers. And it will take you probably about 3 months before you get a reply back. Because the person who you're challenging don't have a clue about the policy or what you're challenging them on. And these are the things I have sat down and learned myself to be able to fight and advocate for individuals. Because you have to learn how they operate. You have to learn about what they are doing. And until we are able to come together to be able to grasp that theory and be able to challenge them, that's your first step moving forward. And then my next step is we have to be able to overcome and deal with the generational trauma that we've been carrying for hundreds of years to be able to come together. Because that is one of the biggest issues I find. And that's my take on it.
Thank you. Intergenerational trauma. Trauma is a huge thing actually in our community, but maybe later on, you can also touch on a stigma of mental health in our communities. We have seen a rising number of suicide, especially in Black and Indigenous communities. Why is it so? But before we continue, I would like to ask if there is anyone in the group who has a question for our speakers. Please raise your hand if you have a question for our speakers, if you would like to say anything. I can see two people have raised their hands, but I can't tell who.
Yeah, I raised up my hands.
Yes, please go ahead and ask the question.
Yeah, I'm Essay. This is Essay in Negbebron. Mine, you know, I've heard all the speakers and they spoke so well. But my major concern is the effect of this racism. If you look at it, as it has to do with the physical health. Yes, they have spoken about ways to fight it, to avoid it. But you know, before you start fighting and avoiding it, it has already affected our physical and mental health. If we go back to what all have been saying, is like racism is kind of associated with the poor mental health, and that also affects the most effect that also causes stress on people that have experienced it. And the most common stress that is associated with it is blood pressure that weakens the immune system. So how do we avoid it by allowing it to affect our health? And the most common one, I'll repeat again, the most common health problem that is associated with it is blood pressure, and because as a result from the stress, how do we fight against that?
Thank you, Essie. Thank you for your question. I would love Juliana to take that question because she started by explaining how the system of oppression or racism actually condition us to respond. So Juliana, would you please answer that question? But let me take, before you answer that question, let me take all the 3 questions for people who have raised their hands, then we are going to answer your questions. Our speakers are going to answer your question. So I can see other 2 people, but I can't see who.
All right. Yes, I'm the second, huh?
Please go ahead.
All right, Barton Peel is my name. Thank you to all speakers. Very insightful kind of thoughts that you've put up there. But I want to agree with you in so much of what you've said. I want, however, to focus on what is the remedy now. I think that should preoccupy our discourse at this point. In my view, if you look at the history of social struggles, anti-discrimination initiatives, at every era in history, it has been responding to the realities in their day and time. So look at people fighting against slave trade or slavery. At that moment, they were really looking at developing policy framework that would outlaw slavery or slave trade. Look at the people fighting racism, the civil rights movement in the United States. They were really looking at developing framework. At this day and age, we have got sufficient policy and legal framework which can remedy the evils or the things that we're complaining about. I would suppose, therefore, the question is how do we take or make the most of the policy and legal framework that we have? The professor had alluded to the Attorney General indicating to him that, look, we have those policies. And the professor is saying, yes, we do, but your implementation does not reflect the principles in your policy. So how do we remedy that? I think that's what we're struggling with in our day and age. The fact that there is a framework, but the implementation and practice seem to have metamorphosized to kind of conceal what should not be done from the policy or framework. So for instance, Canada, for instance, is a member of Inter-American Human Rights Commission. Inter-American Human Rights Commission has got a court. These statistics that we're talking about here, they can be taken to court. And I don't think Canada would want to defend that type of a case with full statistics coming. The measures like, okay, if there is a policy, human rights demands that there has to be indicators that should demonstrate that that policy is complied with. So if you're complaining about correctional services being discriminatory, the criminal justice system, there has to be indicators, and that's a human rights requirement. It's an obligation which the state has to comply with. So what am I trying to say in a nutshell? Don't you think, our speakers, that the challenge in our generation is that we're being reactive and not proactive, that we're being emotional, unlike our colleagues in the civil rights movement? I think we're just being reactive, pity-partying, and crying out, instead of gathering research, building up cases against these states, taking them and say, all right, you have this policy, where are the indicators for compliance and accountability for these policies? We don't do that, but we're just talking over and over. How do you think we can address that?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. So that question is going to go to Richard specifically, because I know he did write to the Attorney General, but then how do we really challenge them in court, or else how, so that at least they could be accountable? Otherwise, how are they accountable? So Asbin, you are next. You are next. Then if there's one more question.
Hi. My name is Spini. So I've heard a lot, and I have some thoughts as well that come up to my mind as I heard all speakers speak. Coming from a medical perspective, I'm a midwifery student, and I keep hearing often there is BIPOC needs and diversity needs to be in healthcare. So now I'm in this, I've somehow made a crack and I've ended up into this program, like, you know, one of the professors was saying. But what is being done about sustainability? There's always this John Henryism and when I'm a midwife, where I have to do more than my other peers. Or there is this situation where as a BIPOC person, my intergenerational trauma has led me with multiple health comorbidities that make it hard, such that my financial privilege, I don't have it, I don't have health. So I end up in maybe a shelter system, right? And there's not enough funding. When the demand is such that these healthcare programs are certain financial privileges, and that's not there, then how do we sustain the BIPOC students that actually end up making it into these programs and, you know, advocating for this? That's one perspective. And I think another one that I want to mention is we keep saying on collaborating individuals and BIPOC, investing in them. That's yes, but I also think that we need to be mindful of bringing in or investing time to train and educate those without that education, to actually invite them into these spaces as well, because sometimes I see here a lot of BIPOC spaces and everyone is educated. And that's great, and that's empowerment. But also sometimes lived experiences and real problems are missed because we're not investing enough time to bring in the BIPOC people who could have a little bit of education and they could just do so much. And so I think that needs to be done. So I guess my question is, how do we create an environment where we can sustain marginalized people who end up making it or trying to be in these programs? And the second thing is, what are we doing to collaborate with people such that we invite BIPOC people who also have lived experiences and not just limited to education or academia? And finally, I often hear the system is broken too, even in the shelter, because I come with a certain amount of privilege. Now I'm challenging the shelter. I'm asking them, well, why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? And I keep hearing this is an emergency. This is what's been set up for an emergency. So we don't have the funding for it, we don't have this for it, we don't have that for it. It's just an emergency. I have serious issues with that comment. It's just an emergency. It seems as if BIPOC solutions are only created in an emergency. Just to kind of sweep it back underneath the rug again and give a false sense of reassurance to people. Is there anything that people can think of or have solutions to how we can keep a continuity of flow so there's no need for these emergencies? And that's kind of what my 3 points are. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that's powerful. Operating in emergency. Not sustainable solutions. And another question, so for all the speakers, you're going to answer that question. And we have one more question. Eugene?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, and
okay,
welcome.
Thank you. My question is directed to Juliana. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Given the fact that you work at the Elizabeth Fry Society, I think, how have you managed to work from an anti-oppressive framework in order to create an inclusive environment for your clients? And the second part is, as a quote unquote white ally, how do you know when to, I guess, stay back as a white ally and know when to walk with and not take up space when you're in community and in the workplace? Thank you.
Wow, thank you for the question. Do I have one more question? One more question, and our speakers are going to take all these questions. So we have one question for each speaker, and the last question is going to be shared by all the speakers. So yes, start, Juliana.
Okay, I can start. Should I start with Eugene's question or should I start with Essay's question?
Sure. You can start with both, that's fine.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with Eugene's question. So I guess to start with, how I come from an anti-oppressive and anti-racist framework is just constantly doing work, constantly learning, constantly listening, constantly being taught by not only my colleagues that are people of color, but my clients that are people of color, people in my community that are people of color. They are the experts. I am not the expert. Especially BIPOC folk, doing whatever I can to understand different cultural things, different trauma experiences. Just, I went to a really awesome talk that talked about just the act of being racialized in our society is in itself a trauma. Learning this stuff, right? Because there is a blindness to white privilege, which is part of the privilege, which is part of the whatever. And when it comes to taking a step aside, I'd say white people, white women, have had enough time talking. And I know I say this while I talk. So I appreciate that. I was asked to come here, but I agree that it's not my time to speak. It is not my time to give my opinions. It is my time to listen and to stand behind in solidarity. That's all I can say about that. My voice has been heard enough. Our voice has been heard enough. Your voices now need to be heard. So I absolutely stand in that, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate also the optics of me being here. So I want to say that I honor and I see that. Moving to Essay's question, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Thank you, Eugene. You talked about the physical health impacts that's happening to racialized folk, not just around the mental, there's tons of mental health impacts with the stigma and the horrible trauma and all that stuff, but you talked specifically around blood pressure and other sort of actual physical health issues. And I think there's a real problem with silos of doctors. There's so many communities, even in Toronto, different provinces, different cities, where there are areas where there are just no doctor's offices. There's no, general practitioners. There's no sort of place for people of color to go and have that support, have someone look, have someone take care. We also know people of color go to hospitals and they're turned away. They're not believed. There's all this stuff. So I really think there needs to be more community health centers that are part of the community. I think it needs to be in the community, staffed by the community, all that kind of stuff, right? Because again, you guys know, your community knows what your community needs. So there needs to be that. And then again, thinking to the credentialism, right? We need to be able to support people with these kind of lived experiences, to Avasani's, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, point, not just people with doctorates and master's degrees being able to work in these community health centers, but also people that have lived experience, that are able to be peers, that are able to be, doctor's assistants, support people just to help the community with different physical and mental health needs. If that makes any sense.
Thank you. And Richard, your question. So your question was around, sometimes we see these images, then we respond, but we don't strategize in either taking the perpetrators to court, like, creating mass action. I have never heard anyone really launching a civil litigation against the police, like a mass, not just an individual level, but like a mass on the trauma that they have caused on Black communities. I have heard about people trying to do reparation, but I haven't heard people like what you explained. So how do we really not being reactive to injustices, but strategically planning and, taking from other civil movement what they had done before, strategically rewriting the policy, reshaping, redesigning the system? That was your question from PD.
Thank you. So first off, I personally have taken the justice system to court in several different occasions, and I've been successful. I have been in the process of doing a class action lawsuits representing offenders with lawyers on my organization board to one, address an issue. So again, there's an issue where offenders who are under Correctional Service Canada care, that is in a halfway house, they receive $85 per week. That's to cigarette, food, shampoo, transportation. That amount has been happening for over 16 years. It has not changed. So we're aware that the cost of a price of a loaf of bread or a dozen egg have changed in the last 15, 16 years. So I have been, that's one of the process I'm in at the present time, to do a class action suit. So the question is that I personally have been going that route, because one thing I've learned again is the fact that the system itself, unless you take them to court and challenge them, that's the only time you'll hear them come in front of you and try to take some sort of an accountability. And even then, they still try to push back and try to, what's the word? Defer the situation to something else, right? I think again that more people needs to forget about the fear. What happens a lot of time, there's so many fear that's input into our people that, and then again, you have to deal with, there's another issue. Besides the fear, there's also the issue of not being able to have the finances to proceed, or in having the education or knowledge or support to proceed. So that's one of the issues that comes across with individuals. I personally tell guys, even on the inside, you know, you're in there, the social worker can give you a small claims form, fill it out, exactly what happened, and sign the money at every canteen, or have your family give the money to serve it and take them to court. All right. I am very much for it, because I'm very much aware that's the only way that they actually, I can get them to have some kind of accountability on paper, and then it really hits them in the kneecap.
Thank you. And our last, but not even last question, is still going to go to Professor. The question was, again, lived experience. How do they come in? And also the issues of physical health. How do we deal with them?
Yeah, so let me touch on, I think, the question that Essie asked earlier. So let me touch on that a little bit as well, in terms of the impact of this on our individual lives. Statistics really tells us that particularly people of African descent tend to be diagnosed more often as having high blood pressure than any other race. I mean, when you go to your doctor's office, I'm sure they will let you know, they'll tell you that. And the question that comes up is why? It's as a result, it could be as a result of the stress, the challenges that we go through, and we can list so many of them. But I think as people from BIPOC community, also what is really important is that we need to take care of ourselves. How do we take care of ourselves? We can take care of ourselves in terms of the food, kinds of food that we eat, resting, making time to rest, making time for self-care and other things. And no, having said this, somebody's going to ask me, how then do I pay for my bills? Because I get paid minimum wage and I have about 3 jobs and I have to go around and all those things. But one thing you need to think about is, yes, you need to do all these things because you need to take care of your bills and what have you. What if this condition worsens and it cripples you and you're unable to go to work, you're unable to go do all these things, what happens then? You know, I've heard stories about people who perhaps maybe been nurses or what have you, been working about how many, numerous jobs, and they invested in the money. And at the end of the day, they suffer, maybe get a stroke, and off they go. You know, we need to realize that we need to start having a different perspective of our life. That life is short and anything at all can happen to us. For me, that is why I use the word me. I've come to realize that life is not about money, but it's about making sure you take care of yourself. Because when we focus on money too much, we may get to a point where we may find ourselves entrapped in certain things, in certain areas, certain aspects of life that we'll not really appreciate. So if we learn to make do, but importantly, taking care of ourselves, making sure we see the doctor on a regular basis for examination and other things, perhaps, I said perhaps, we'll be able to avoid some of these things. And also, I think there was this touch, brother mentioned something about framework that has already been implemented, and we tending to be more reactive instead of proactive. When he said that, I mean, there were a lot of thoughts that went through my mind. So perhaps maybe I'll do a little bit of a historical analysis. Let's look at the United States with the civil rights movement and other things. I think slavery was abolished somewhere in 1867, 65 in the United States. And so we're looking at almost going on 100 years plus. And yet there are some aspects, maybe not in chains, not working on cotton farms, but some aspects of slavery still existing in the United States right now. So the question that we may want to ask ourselves is it because people are not being proactive? I would say no, the system is shaped in a way that they try to impose these things without necessarily letting people know that this is what we have. A typical example would be this idea of colonialism. You look at a number of African countries, we have the French colonies, and we have the English colonies and other things. It's abolished. Colonialism is abolished in Africa. But I'm yet to see how many African countries can we say is really liberated in terms of resources and providing for the needs of their countrymen and other things. A lot of them are still under the vestiges of colonialism because they are under the influence of the Western power. And without the Western power, there's so much they can't do. Because it's as a result of this that a lot of our leaders are corrupt in these African countries. And I can say that on authority. So we can, even when we look at the ICC, that is International Court of ICJ or whatever, International Court of Justice, which leaders are being tried? It's only African leaders to the best of my knowledge. So that tells me that the system itself that is set up is not really it doesn't really, because there are a lot of people from the Western world that have committed atrocities, apart from this leader from, I think, Slobodan Milosevic or something, who was tried at a court. Most of the people who've been tried are Africans. So the question is, the system in itself, as we can see, it's not fair. So from my perspective, it's not so much we're being reactive to the issues, because we need to find ways of addressing the issues. We can go to court as much as possible, but there are times if we're not very careful, it's going to be a total waste of time. I remember when George Floyd's incident happened in the United States, people were saying that police have been taken to court the umpteenth time, numerous times, and none of them, I mean, with all these court appearances, these police officers were not found guilty. So that speaks to the fact that there are some underlying systemic issues that are at play. So in a job, it's not so much being reactive, but being knowledgeable of the issues around and realizing that we need to take steps to address them. It will surprise you to realize that in the 21st century right now, there are people who keep saying that there's no racism in this part of the world. Even in Canada, telling us that there's no racism in Canada. When you talk about microaggressions, they shake their heads that it doesn't exist. And these are the issues that we need to address. Do you take somebody to court because they don't believe in racism? How do you address that? So it's really important that we find ways of engaging, because until we do that, we're going to play the blame game. And the moment we start playing those games, half the battle is lost. And that is why we need to come together as a united front and find ways of doing it. My mind goes back to India before they gained independence. They decided, just blanked out on the name of the civil rights leader who led India to independence. He said they were not going to engage in any fights, but what they're going to engage in is they're going to engage in standing against the oppressive powers. But they're not going to engage in, what do you call it, that tug of war in terms of maybe being violent. So the non-violent approach. And it worked. So I think that as racialized folk, if we are knowledgeable of the issues around us and we find ways of addressing us, until we do that, there's always going to be that division amongst us. Now, moving on to the other issue with regard to the system, talking about the impact, lived experience and other things. You mentioned the, what do you call it? I think I blanked out on that, but the system as it is. One thing we need to realize that we live in a capitalist society. And in a capitalist society is the survival of the fittest. And we would have people really, at the bottom of the totem pole. Do a lot of people really care about those people? Our politicians will always come to us, and let us know how much they care. But when they get into power, how often do they come to us and say, how can we help these folk? So I think we need to rally. And that is where we all come in and say, how can we really use our resources to be there to support people, to engage and other things? And that is where perhaps maybe issues like maybe social work and other things come in and say, hey, yes, the resources are not there, but we can do what we can to help you really get yourself up, and brush yourself and move on. Because under capitalism, they will tell you that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And that reminds me of Martin Luther King, who would say, well, you tell me to pull myself up by my bootstraps. What if I don't have legs? So I would think we need to be a bit sensitive and say, how do we engage? How do we work? How do we journey together? And I think with that mindset, perhaps we'll be able to accomplish something. I'm not sure if I've been able to answer all the questions, but these are my thoughts.
Oh, wow. The conversation on racism will have to continue and still continues here. And of course, we can always, if the speakers honor us again, we can always invite them to answer these questions and continue the discussions. But for now, it looks like we have passed our time. So I would like to, before I can thank everyone, we do have support. Again, if you have any house issue, food issue, please call us if you have that issue. Benita, welcome.
Okay, so support is available during this section. You may contact these numbers. For mental health and counselors are available. You have 1-866-797-0000. Canadian Association of Mental Health, CAMH, we have 416-535-8501 or 180-046-32338. Thank you.
Thank you, Benita. So it looks like we are coming towards to the end of our program. So thank you so much. So our next forum, because the conversation is going to continue, we're going to have a drumming session on 27. But before that, we'll have a barbecue. So I think we'll have to eat. If you don't, I'll be scared. But yeah, if you love to eat, please join us on the 13th August, free event, fun, and also with a lot of activities, but also we're going to engage in this conversation on racism and gender-based violence. So join us if you have an issue, always contact us. And I guess we've come to the end of our discussions, the time. So I'd like to ask Giselle to thank our speakers on behalf of our board and also to close the program. I'm your host, Sandrine, and again, I'll see you next time. And I'm honored that you've been part of this conversation. And I think somebody once told me, in our DNA, there's nothing like stopping to fight. So we are always going to fight against racism because in our DNA, there is something called resilience. Of course, we have inherited trauma, that's a fact, but there is also something about fighting and not giving up that we've inherited. So thank you for our speakers for really creating time and space, for talking to our community, and for our participants. I'm honored that you created time. You could have been too many places you chose to be here. So thank you.
Yes. Okay, so first of all, I don't even know where to begin. Everything that I've heard today, I've either felt myself as a new immigrant to Canada with, you know, past degrees, but having to hear about having the Canadian experience and having to go through all that process. Myself being a social worker, I haven't met another Black master social worker as yet. I'm sure they're out there, but I haven't seen them or met them as yet. And for me, as a Black woman, I'm like, you know, where are they? And just thinking about all the things that happen within our society and sustainability. How do we maintain some of these things? How do we ensure that we have Black women and just Black people in general going to these higher levels of education and not being given certain scholarships? Been there, done that. You know, you're not provided certain scholarships because you're either not from the country or they don't extend it beyond certain, you know, percentiles or whatever. And so, I mean, there are just so many different barriers that you face, but like the professor was saying, we do have some people that have made it to a certain point, and we do have certain people that we can look up to. And I just want to thank all the speakers for all of your information today, all of the strong words of encouragement on how we move forward and how we go to the next level and how we continue on the fight. Always thank Sandrine for bringing up these conversations. Always thanking her for bringing up sometimes controversial conversations that we do have to have. And this is the only way sometimes that we can get through them. So on behalf of the Board Community Service Center and the team, we want to thank everyone for joining us today, for taking the time off from your busy schedules. I'm pretty sure at some point we'll probably have you guys back again, because I cannot stop singing your praises of all the information that you have given to us today. I'm just going to put it all in my Instapot and let it fester and, you know, just really learn and grow from it. So thank you so much again on behalf of the board, and we look forward to meeting and speaking with you guys again in the future.
And before we go, Juliana, special thanks. Actually, allyship is end. We have to give it to you. So on behalf of the board, and so you have ended. Now you are our ally. Sometimes white people assume they're just ally. No, but they have to end it. We have to recognize. It's a two-way. You cannot just, so, but you have ended for the work you, I've seen the work you have done and they've talked to you. So we have ended. So, and Eugene, for your question, we have, next time we'll tell her how to support us, but thank you also for being with us. And for Professor Magnus, I'm not going to, otherwise my parents are going to punish me if I mispronounce your name one more time. So Professor, thank you. I've been honored to talk to you, and even yesterday, and Richard, it's an honor to know you. So I'm glad that you, all of you have been supporters for the Black community and also stand. We do, the younger generation, we stand on your shoulders, so we are grateful. So thank you once again on behalf of our board. Good night, until next time. Barbecue on the 30th.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.